Hey again, everybody. Welcome back to another installment of Speaking of Sundara, where I talk about Sundara Dawn of a New Age, my fantasy RPG setting. And as folks have known, if you've been coming to the channel for a while, I've been steadily working my way through the Cities of Sundara and Species of Sundara books that have already come out and sort of talking about the inspiration behind them and what I was hoping to accomplish. But this week, we're moving on to one that I considered a bit of a personal challenge for me. Big confession for everybody who doesn't know me, I was never a huge fan of halflings. It was just a thing I never really got into, but since I'm trying to take Tolkien's work and sort of keep the inspiration that it had for fantasy games in general, I didn't want to exclude them from my setting. So my goal was to take the basic idea of what halflings were and how they'd been played with in the past and do something unique and different with them. Something that would interest players like me who never really enjoyed them and never really wanted to play with them, but which would also appeal to those who do like them and have wanted to use them in the past. Apologies for the audio. I tried to get this done before the construction crew showed up, but with retakes and my host putting in a lot of his opinions on what's going on, I've had to do a couple of reshoots, so there's going to be some weird background noises going forward. Just ignore them. Everything's fine. But anyway, without further ado, of a thing that I thought was very interesting and that I wanted to sort of start off with as far as how halflings and Sundara work. Of Like all the other species I've talked about, they don't have a specific agreed upon canon origin, but like everyone else, they have their own myths and their own legends as to how they came to be. And one of those things is that they're very closely tied to dwarves as far as mythology goes. And for those who didn't watch the Dwarven video or didn't pick up the book, the major myth for most of the dwarven species and subspecies is that they were created by the original primordial giants, the formers of the world, because they were too large, too powerful to actually get in and finish all the fine details of this thing that they had made. So, each of them would go and they would create their own little crews of people to go forth and kind of put the finishing touches, the end polish on this world. And according to those myths, the additional pieces that had been carved off of the dwarves, the little pebbles that had gone spinning, were still filled with all of that creative magic, all of that desire for craft, all of that desire for making things, for beautifying things. And that became halflings. They were sort of a byproduct of this. Now, how much truth there is to these myths is entirely up to whoever happens to be hearing them. However, there is a definite history between these two species. In Sundara, our dwarves and halflings have kind of a cousin's relationship, if you will. Dwarves consider themselves, the elder species, and they're more learned, more wise, and so they've kind of taken halfling communities under their wing in a lot of places. When it sort of makes sense if you have Hasrada living in the mountains, then you'll want to have the local halfling community that lives in the hills sort of nearby as good neighbors, and you'll want to form bonds with them and going forward. And whether the culture inspired the myth or the myth inspired the culture, no one's entirely sure, but that is a definite part of how halflings have been created in the setting, and it plays into a lot of what we see with the cultures I'm going to describe for them going forward. But as I've done in the previous videos, I wanted to sort of talk about the 5 different halfling varieties that I gave folks, and as normal, these are just the starting pack, more or less, of if you want to do something different, if you want to add your own, there's plenty of space for it, and if folks really like what I'm doing and they want to see me do more going forward, I left the door open so I can come back and add more things to it later. But to get those started, the Veil are the first of the halfling varieties that we see, and they're the ones that are going to feel, I'm not going to say most original, but most familiar. They live in the hills, they tend to be far away from most settlements, and they have the sort of hobbit holes that you would expect. But unlike what we see in places like the Shire, the Veil aren't really farmers as a whole, they're more shepherds. And so you'll see these massive flocks of sheep that they keep. And the sheep are kind of their central resource of everything that they need they get from these animals, whether that's wool, whether it's food and milk, etc., etc., etc. And yes, and for those who are wondering, I did look it up. Sheep's milk is not a thing that humans may like as much. Halflings love it, particularly the Veil. But because they have this central industry where everyone participates, and it only takes a couple of people to keep it going, this allows the Vale to sort of branch out and to have a more leisurely lifestyle and to pursue things like art or music or craft in ways that, societies where everyone's toiling all the time, they just don't have the energy or the spare time for. And it allows them to create a lot of really interesting things and to take up really strange and unusual pursuits one might not expect, whether it's philosophers sitting near the river or just fishermen who, they don't really need to do more now that they've brought the flock in and the shearing season's over. But beyond the Vale, we have the Suffolk. And the Suffolk sort of fill that role of the lost children of the forest, of fairy creatures. Even though they are indeed still halflings, they are not fey creatures, as one might expect. But they're green. No one's entirely sure why they're green, but they are. The Suffolk are also notoriously, we'll say, shy. They're not afraid of people as a whole, but they are well aware of their size and they are well aware of what they can and can't do. So they tend to pick areas of forest and they'll form burrows in these large, like, subterranean communities. And so it looks like they appear or disappear at will. And there's all sorts of stories about these strange green creatures who will watch you and then vanish when you try to find them. And if they really like you, they might leave you gifts or warnings of things that you need to be wary of. If you can make a friend of the Suffolk, though, as lots of travelers attempt to do, you have friends for life. They are very loyal if you can get them to come out of their holes for you. The third one that we find in the book are the Baroners. And the Baroners are salvagers, is probably the best word for them. They are just clans of halflings who will find abandoned places that nobody wants, fairly common in a lot of fantasy settings, and then either clear out the dangers themselves, or they'll wait until an adventuring party comes along, and once they've slain the monsters, killed the necromancer, whatever it is, they'll move in and rehab the place. So you find them in a lot of former ruins as they sort of remake what was and bring it back to its former glory. You find several of the towns of Sundara mention Baroners specifically as the founders of the new iteration of places that are built on the ruins of ancient and forgotten empires. And it's just one of those things of this travels through into larger parts of their culture of they don't waste anything, whether it's space, whether it's wood shavings taken off of a carpentry project, whether it's the chaff after you've separated the wheat. They find ways to reuse everything. And it can make them seem a little strange to outsiders. It can give them a less than uniform look, particularly as this applies to their very, very patched clothing, their hand-me-down items. But when it comes to creatures that are creative and that think outside the box and attempt to find solutions to problems, Baroners are always looking for the most efficient way to take care of everyone, and it makes them very good neighbors to have, and they're welcome in a lot of communities as a result of this, as they are very solution-oriented as far as creatures go. The fourth one we had were the Skycatchers, who are isolated mostly because they tend to live in very high places, which is not where one usually expects to see halflings. But they earned the name because they tend to use all sorts of different methods to achieve flight. Now, some of them will tame what to them are very large birds. They don't need rocks like normal people might, but large size falcons, eagles, things like that that they can ride. There are others that will work on practicing magics of learning the ways of the winds so that they can just float on the breezes. And in some places, like those who are neighboring Horde Reach, you'll have them with gliding suits. So they'll sort of have an entire community of base jumpers, just for the fun of it, really. But the Skycatchers have a noted tendency to display the halfling bravery of once you live on top of a mountain and you jump off of it for fun, there's not a whole lot of things out there that'll scare you. And they tend to be a little off-putting to people who don't know their ways, who aren't familiar with their culture, particularly those who find themselves unknowingly violating Skycatcher space, because that's when you have entire just squadrons of these creatures just swooping down on your caravan or dropping things on you from on high, far outside of bowshot. and that can be problematic if you don't establish some sort of agreement as to who's allowed to come and go, when, and where. And lastly, I offered the Tidelings, which, as the name implies, are halflings who live almost, if not entirely, their lives on the water. They have these very large ship-based communities, and some of them will have a single ship, some of them will have many smaller ships that travel like a school of fish, others will have ships that they sort of combine together. But it's almost like Waterworld, of no one's entirely sure why they live their lives out on the water, and when they try to explain it to outsiders, it just makes more confusion rather than less of it's just the way they live their lives. Sometimes there's a deep spiritual reason of there's a connection to, the seas and the ocean. Sometimes it's just they inherited the boat and this is the way you take care of it. But they have a reputation as being lucky among sailors, particularly if you're lost out in the middle of the ocean, you have nowhere to go, you're running out of supplies. Titling ships can be a lifesaver, especially if you're not just lost, but you're adrift, if your ship got wrecked, if you've been marooned on an island. Titlings are the ones that most often come to your aid, particularly because they have a code of you don't leave even your enemies to the ocean. Everyone deserves to be picked up rather than left to drown in the salt. They're also the ones who know most of the dangers that lurk out in the deep waters, and so they can offer lots of insight and advice, such as, which islands to avoid, where you can find dangerous shoals, where you might run aground on things you weren't expecting. But even tidelings who choose to leave their ship or who are asked to leave are phenomenal sailors, so you will find them on merchant vessels, you may find them among pirates, you find them all over the place because the sea just ends up calling to them, whether it's due to something deep inside of themselves or it's due to just a lifetime of learning how to live on the water. Excuse me. But those are sort of what I wanted to start with. I wanted to have halflings that didn't all just feel like slight variations on the norm. I wanted each of them to sort of exemplify traits we were used to or to show them in a unique and different light that we aren't used to seeing them in. And that's kind of what I tried to do with all of them up to this point. I just feel that with halflings it came across a little extra. But if any of that sounds fun, as I mentioned earlier, you can find the books in the description below. They're available for both the Dungeons and Dragons 5th Edition and Pathfinder Classic. If you have any questions about the Tidelings, any opinions on where you'd like to see me go next, either with the species or the cities, or if you'd like to see me do something entirely different, leave that in the comments as well. And until next time, happy gaming, everybody.